Hello, this is Rich, and welcome to part 5 on continuing to write our flow graph node. We're going to continue writing flow graph logic here. We left off where we actually added the target entity flag, which allows us to target an entity, which will basically just add a slot on our entity that you can place an entity into, plug it into. And that is needed because what we're going to do is we're going to listen for that particular entity. So we're going to create our node, and then we're going to put the entity we want to listen to, get the events about, in that slot. And we'll only receive events for the entity. In this case, we only want to receive events when the player places a mine. Only when we place a mine. So for our entity slot, we're going to plug in the player. That way we only get events about the player. Now, there's two very important things in the flow graph node here. sActivationInfo struct and the entity that is held by the flow node if you have one. So it's very important that we add, it's optional but highly recommended, that you add a member of sActivationInfo. So you can have it whenever you need to access it, not a pointer. So now we're going to talk about the get memory usage. This allows the entity system, or in this case the flow node system here, to get memory statistics about our flow node. All we need to do is take the sizer that it passed in and just add our class to the sizer. So just pass in this here, and there we go, that's all we got to do. Now for the process events, if we run a switch and pass in the eFlow event that happened, there's a few of them. And I'm only going to go over a few here. We have the update, which happens every single frame. This will get called. Activate. It sends if one of your ports are activated. So let's say our input port is activated. We're not going to need this, so the update. We don't have any input ports. Final activate, still related to the activate. It just gets called like post activated. Initialize. Now this is important, and we will be using this here. This happens pretty much whenever CryEngine decides it thinks it's important to update information. So it's not like an update every frame, but this will give you a few calls every once in a while to make sure your stuff is up to date. Final initialize is like a post initialize. It happens after the initialize. And set entity ID. This happens if our port is the targeting an entity and whenever it's set. So when we set an entity to our port, it tells us what entity we set it as. This is very important. We should also add the iEntity to keep track of whatever is in our port here. So ptargetEnt. Wonderful. So what we're going to do is whenever an entity is set on our port, we're going to take the ptargetEnt and we're going to set it. And with every flow event, we have the activation info. Like I said, it's very important. Activation info is pretty much just information about a flow node event. So anytime you receive an event, it contains a bunch of information about the event. In this case, it will hold the entity. So whenever the entity port is set on the node, we'll set it our entity. We also need to get events about remember I said the entity events about the entity that's in the port? This is a good place to do it. We can do that by getting the entity system. So global environment, pEntity system, and we'll add an entity event listener. Very simple. First of all, it wants the entity ID of the entity we want to receive events about, then the specific event we're interested in, and the listener that's going to be receiving the class, which is us. So we'll take the ptarget entity and we'll get the ID, so that way we can listen to the entity event for that. The event we want is the entity underscore event underscore mine placed. And the listener is this. We are the listener, this node here. But here's a problem. What if we set the entity ID more than once? What if we change it out? Like first we want it to be the player, but then we decide, you know what, we're going to change it to a different entity. Well, now we'll have a bunch of things registered to receive events when we really don't want it to. We only want to receive whatever is currently in the slot. So here's what we'll do. First, we're going to check if the ptarget exists, if we actually have one. If we do, we're actually going to remove listener. And we're going to get it. We're going to remove listening to that event. We're not going to listen to it anymore. And then, if the activation info, if the entity it's sent in does exist, we're going to register it. And then finally, we're going to set our entity. So every time you set the entity ID, we're going to check. We're going to unregister you just in case you are different. Then we're going to add an event listener to the new entity that was passed in, if it was new, and then we are going to set our target entity. Wonderful. Now, when we destroy our node, the set entity ID won't happen, I don't believe. So what we're going to do is make sure that when our node is destroyed in the destructor, that we unregister the listening. Beautiful. Wonderful. So now we are able to get the entity that was set on the port, and we saved it. Next, we'll go to the initialize. So whenever this node is initialized, we will take the activation info from it, so we can store that. And since this one, the PActInfo that's sent in, is a pointer, we'll just dereference it to store it, to copy everything into our version. Absolutely wonderful. Now, the last thing we need to do is we will get this event here. We've given it the size of our class so we can do some profiling on it. We've set our entity, the one that's in the port, and we've got the activation info for later use. Now, all we got to do is when we get the entity event that a mine has been placed, let's activate all the output ports on the port. So very simple. First, we're going to check if we have our entity is still in the port. So I'm going to take a ptarget entity. Do we still have an entity in the port? If we do, then good, we can continue. Very simply, we're going to activate output. Very simple. We're going to pass the activation info. Every activate output needs our activation info. That's why we stored it later. And we'll get the memory address because it wants a pointer. Next is the port. What port do we want? Well, we want to output, so 0, 1, 2. See? 0, 1, 2. We want to output the placer and the mine before we trigger. Okay? So we'll do placer, mine, trigger. So we'll do 0, 1, 2, 0. 1, 2, 0. And the value of 1 is the entity ID. And we'll go ahead and copy 3. Boom. All right. So the first one here is the placer. So it's the placer, the entity. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, P target. The target is the placer because we're listening for events when he places a mine. So get the ID. Beautiful. The second is the mine. Well, we know that because we can check the event.nparam0 for that parameter. So beautiful. Now the entity ID of the mine. And the last one is just a trigger. We don't really need anything to pass out that. It's just a trigger. So we'll just pass just null, which is 0 technically. And there we go. We've actually created our fully functional mine listener that will activate, the node will activate a trigger saying, hey, a mine was placed. Also, here's the entity ID of the mine, and here's the entity ID of the placer. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed. The next part, we're going to actually set up FlowGraph and test it out. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.